Mr. Darcy, however, snubbed Elizabeth. She, however, remained contemptuous towards him. Jane Austen was an English novelist. Austen's plots often explore the dependence of women on marriage in the pursuit of favorable social standing and economic security. Her works critique the novels of sensibility of the second half of the 18th century and are part of the transition to 19th-century literary realism. Her use of biting irony, along with her realism and social commentary, have earned her acclaim among critics and scholars. Now, let's get started. The novel opens at Longbourn, the Bennet family's estate. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet had 5 children: Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. The family engaged in a conversation about Mr. Bingley, a single man of large fortune, who was going to be renting the nearby estate of Netherfield Park. Mrs. Bennet saw Mr. Bingley as a potential suitor for one of her daughters. The Bennets first met Mr. Bingley and his companions at the Meryton ball. The townspeople concluded that Mr. Bingley was perfectly amiable and agreeable. Meanwhile, Mr. Bingley took an immediate liking to Jane Bennet. Mr. Bingley's friend Mr. Darcy, however, snubbed Elizabeth. The community decided that Darcy was proud and disagreeable because of his reserve and his refusal to dance. Jane found Bingley's sisters, Caroline and Mrs. Hurst, to be amiable, but Elizabeth saw them as arrogant. After further interactions, it became evident that Jane and Bingley were interested in one another. However, while Bingley made his partiality quite obvious, Jane was universally cheerful and somewhat shy. Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend, had a very pragmatic view of marriage. She recommended that Jane made her regard for Bingley more obvious. At the same time, Mr. Darcy began to admire Elizabeth, captivated by her fine eyes and lively wit. She, however, remained contemptuous towards him. When Jane was invited for dinner at Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet refused to provide her with a carriage, hoping that the impending rainstorm was going to force her to spend the night there. After getting caught in the rain, Jane actually fell ill and had to remain at Netherfield for many days. Upon hearing that Jane was ill, Elizabeth walked to Bingley's estate through the muddy fields. Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst were scandalized by Elizabeth's rumpled appearance, but joined Bingley in welcoming her nonetheless. Elizabeth continued to impress Darcy during her time nursing Jane at Netherfield. However, she remained blind to his affections and continued to see him as a proud and haughty man. Caroline, who hoped to attract Mr. Darcy herself, grew extremely jealous of Elizabeth and mocked her lowly status. Mrs. Bennet and her younger daughters came to Netherfield to check on Jane, and Elizabeth was mortified by their foolish behavior and complete lack of manners. Bingley's admiration for Jane continued unabated, though, and his affection was evident in his genuine solicitude for her recovery. After Jane recovered, she returned home with Elizabeth. Meanwhile, a militia regiment was stationed at the nearby town of Meryton, where Mrs. Bennet's sister lived. Lydia and Kitty loved to stay with their aunt in Meryton so they could socialize and flirt with the military officers. Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet's distant cousin, wrote a letter stating his intention to visit. Collins was in line to inherit Longbourn because the estate had been entailed away from any female children. Mr. Collins was a clergyman, and his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who was also Darcy's aunt, had suggested that he find a wife. Therefore, Collins hoped to make amends for the entailment by marrying one of Mr. Bennet's daughters. Mr. Collins proved himself to be a silly man, speaking in long, pompous speeches with an air of solemn formality. The Miss Bennets and Mr. Collins went for a walk to Meryton. On the way, they met an officer in the regiment named Mr. Wickham. They also ran into Mr. Darcy. When Darcy and Wickham saw one another, both men became visibly uncomfortable. Wickham showed an immediate partiality for Elizabeth, and they spoke at length over the following days. In one of these conversations, Wickham explained his past with Darcy. Darcy's father had promised that Wickham, his godson, would inherit a good living after the elder man's death. However, Darcy failed to fulfill his father's dying wishes and left Wickham to support himself. Elizabeth had already predisposed to think badly of Darcy, did not question Wickham's account. When Elizabeth told Wickham's story to Jane, however, Jane refused to think badly of either Wickham or Darcy, insisting that there must have been some misunderstanding. Bingley hosted a ball at Netherfield. He and Jane spent the whole evening together and their mutual attachment became increasingly obvious. However, Mrs. Bennet spoke loudly about their imminent engagement, and Elizabeth noted that Darcy overheard her. Later that evening, Darcy asked Elizabeth to dance and she reluctantly accepted. She did not enjoy it and couldn't understand why he had asked her. Mr. Collins paid particularly close attention to Elizabeth at the ball, and even reserved the first 2 dances with her. The next day, Mr. Collins proposed to Elizabeth. She refused, but it took him a while to accept her rejection. He assumed she was simply playing coy, as he believed females do. Mrs. Bennet was extremely angry at Elizabeth for refusing Collins, but Mr. Bennet was glad. Mr. Collins quickly shifted his attentions to Charlotte Lucas. He proposed to Charlotte, and she accepted. Elizabeth was disappointed in her friend for agreeing to marry such a silly man simply for the sake of financial security. Bingley travelled to London for business but planned to return to Netherfield. His sisters and Darcy soon followed him. Soon thereafter, Caroline wrote to Jane to say that Bingley had changed his plans and would not return to Netherfield for at least 6 months. Caroline also informed Jane that she hoped Bingley would marry Darcy's younger sister in order to unite the 2 families' fortunes. Jane was heartbroken. Elizabeth thought that Darcy and Bingley's sisters had somehow managed to dissuade Bingley from proposing to Jane. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Elizabeth's aunt and uncle, came to Longbourn to visit. Noting Jane's sadness, they invited her to stay with them in London for a while. Elizabeth hoped that Jane would run into Bingley while in London. Mrs. Gardiner warned Elizabeth against marrying Wickham because of his poor financial situation. While Jane was in London, Caroline Bingley was extremely rude to her. Jane assumed that Mr. Bingley knew she was in London, and since he did not call, she decided he no longer cared for her. In Meryton, Wickham suddenly transferred his attentions from Elizabeth to Miss King, a woman who had recently acquired £10,000 from an inheritance. Elizabeth travelled to visit Charlotte, now Mrs. Collins, at her new home in Kent. During her stay in Hunsford, Elizabeth and the others were often invited to dine at Rosings, Lady Catherine's large estate. Lady Catherine was completely arrogant and domineering. Mr. Darcy and his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam visited Rosings. Darcy also paid a lot of attention to Elizabeth and often visited the parsonage. He also purposely met her during her daily walks through the nearby gardens. One day, Colonel Fitzwilliam mentioned to Elizabeth that Darcy recently had saved a close friend from an imprudent marriage. Elizabeth realized that Fitzwilliam was referring to Bingley and Jane. She was so angry at Darcy that she gave herself a headache, which kept her from visiting Rosings that night. Darcy visited Elizabeth while she was alone at the parsonage and confessed that he wanted to marry her despite her low family connections. Elizabeth was shocked at his arrogant address and rudely refused him. She also rebuked him for acting in such an ungentlemanly manner, and accused him of ruining Jane's future happiness and betraying Wickham. Darcy was shocked that Elizabeth had declined his proposal and left. The next day, Darcy found Elizabeth and handed her a letter. She read it after he was gone. First, Darcy defended himself for dissuading Bingley from proposing to Jane. Not only were Jane's family connections low, but she did not seem to show any particular preference for Bingley. Darcy then detailed his side of the Wickham story. Before his death, Darcy's father asked Darcy to provide Wickham with a living, provided Wickham enter the clergy. Wickham, however, did not want to enter the clergy, and asked Darcy for £3,000 to study law. Wickham soon squandered all his money on a dissolute lifestyle, and then asked Darcy for another stipend, promising to enter the clergy this time. When Darcy refused, Wickham seduced Darcy's teenage sister, Georgiana. Before they could elope, Darcy intervened and saved Georgiana's honor. Elizabeth initially refused to believe Darcy's claims, but came to consider the possibility as she reflected on Wickham's behavior. She realized she was inclined to believe Wickham because she was prejudiced against Darcy and because she was flattered by his attention. Soon afterwards, Elizabeth went on vacation with the Gardiners. Their first stop was close to Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's estate. The Gardiners wanted to take a tour, and Elizabeth only agreed once she learned that Darcy was currently away. During their tour of the estate, Mrs. Reynolds, the Pemberley housekeeper, praised Darcy unequivocally. Elizabeth also expressed some regret that she would have never been mistress of this estate. The travellers suddenly ran into Darcy, who had arrived early. Surprisingly, Darcy was extremely cordial to both Elizabeth and the Gardiners. The next morning, Darcy and Bingley visited Elizabeth and the Gardiners at their inn. Elizabeth could see that Bingley still thought fondly of Jane. One morning, Elizabeth received a letter from Jane, announcing that Lydia had eloped with Wickham. Worse yet, the family feared that Wickham did not actually intend to marry her. Jane asked Elizabeth to return home immediately. As soon as Elizabeth read the letter, Darcy arrived at the inn. In her frantic state, Elizabeth told him what had happened. Darcy felt partially to blame, since he had never publicly exposed Wickham's wickedness. Elizabeth and the Gardiners departed for Longbourn almost immediately. There, a hysterical Mrs. Bennet had locked herself in her room. They learned from Colonel Forster that Wickham had amassed over £1,000 of gambling debts. The next day, Mr. Gardiner left for London to join Mr. Bennet, who was already there looking for Lydia. After many days of fruitless searching, Mr. Bennet returned home, leaving the search in Mr. Gardiner's hands. Soon, a letter arrived from Mr. Gardiner announcing that Lydia and Wickham had been found. Wickham had agreed to marry Lydia if Mr. Bennet provided her with her equal share of his wealth. Considering the size of his debts, Mr. Bennet knew that Wickham wouldn't have agreed marry Lydia for so little money. He concluded that Mr. Gardiner must have paid off Wickham's debts to solidify the deal. After their marriage, Lydia and Wickham visited Longbourn. Lydia was not the least bit remorseful for her conduct. At dinner, Lydia let it slip to Elizabeth that Darcy had been presented at her wedding. Curious, Elizabeth wrote to Mrs. Gardiner for details. Her aunt explained that it was Darcy who found Lydia and Wickham and paid off Wickham's debts. Mrs. Gardiner believed that Darcy had done this out of love for Elizabeth. Bingley and Mr. Darcy soon returned to Netherfield Park, and they called at Longbourn frequently. After several days, Bingley proposed to Jane. She accepted, and the family was very happy. In the meantime, Darcy left on a short business trip to London. While he was gone, Lady Catherine came to Longbourn, furious after hearing a rumour that Elizabeth and Darcy were engaged. She forbade Elizabeth from ever accepting a proposal from Mr. Darcy, but Elizabeth was completely offended and refused to promise anything. Lady Catherine left in a huff. After returning from his trip, Darcy told Elizabeth that his affection had not changed. She then revealed that her feelings had changed and that she would be happy to marry him. They discussed how and why their sentiments had changed since Darcy's first proposal. Darcy had since realized he was wrong to act so proudly and place so much emphasis on class differences. Elizabeth, meanwhile, accepted that she was wrong to judge Darcy prematurely and admitted that she had allowed her vanity to affect her judgment. Both couples married. Elizabeth and Darcy lived at Pemberley. After living in Netherfield for a year, Jane and Bingley moved to an estate near Pemberley. Lydia and Wickham tired of each other eventually, and Lydia kept asking her sisters for money. Kitty spent most of her time with her two elder sisters, and her education and character began to improve. Mary remained at home to keep her mother company. Mr. Bennet was very happy that his two oldest daughters had married so happily, and Mrs. Bennet was glad that her daughters had married so.
Please subscribe to my channel. We're gonna show you world masterpieces in about 15 minutes with manga. Manga is Japanese-style comics that is easy for everyone to understand. We're sure that you can grasp the context shortly.
See you next time.